We have Breanne Boland, and she's going to tell us about CLI server surveillance and also writing your first novel. I'm excited for this talk. Thank you for being here, Breanne.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. All right, one second, let's get some slides shared. All right, what an amazing talk to get to follow. That's spectacular. I couldn't have hoped for a better lead-in. Hello, yeah, welcome to CLI server surveillance and then abrupt subject change, writing your first novel, a talk in 2 parts. To start, I can give you 2 parts of who I am. I'm a security partner on the Gusto product security team. I'm someone who likes poking around in Linux, and I'm still delighted by what you can do on the command line, hence this talk. And more word-wise, I've been a fiction writer since I was about 12. I have a writing degree. It is the only degree I have. And I'm someone who got through the pandemic, so far anyway, by writing a lot, like a huge amount. As a result, as you might guess, I'm also that person who likes writing documentation. And I'm not talking about that today, but I am at B-Side San Francisco in May, so I hope you can join us. For you, because I'm a person who, surprise, learns better by reading rather than watching video, I made a blog post version of this talk so you can follow along. It's at breanneboland.com. If you really like the second half of my talk, I have a writing newsletter that comes out monthly-ish, probably going to come out in the next week. And I've linked everything at Twitter, so easy. And if you have questions, I will be in Slack after this. If there's any questions we don't get to at the end of the video, feel free to @me. I'll probably be hovering around all day once I do my post-talk crashing. All right, talk the first, CLI server surveillance, which means that we have to talk about OSINT. OSINT, if you haven't bumped into it, is open source intelligence. And it is super fun. It's one of the reasons that I was so excited this talk got accepted. So what we'll be doing with the command line stuff we're going to talk about in a minute is OSINT, which is when you use publicly available information to learn more about a site, a company, a network, or some other entity with the goal of creating a more complete picture than the information they released was probably meant to give you. The commands and how I will suggest doing them are all legal to use, but I've noted certain uses here and there that might cross the line, and please don't do that. If in doubt, remember that typically one person using one command is fine, but scripting something that hammers a target, especially without permission, is a bad idea for a whole bunch of reasons. And then before we get any further, a little note on systems and context. I am Mac-based, so the things I say unavoidably are slanted by that. The Linux commands and flags are often the same, but not always. And I also note how to do these things on Windows in a light way, different command names, stuff like that. You're gonna have to experiment, but I promise you that's actually the fun part too. So why do we need to know this stuff? Like, why can it help you in your job? I've most often used the tools and the methods I'm about to describe when I was researching a target for work with the permission of the owners and servers. Legally vetted, written permission, glorious. In my last job, I sometimes did time box pen testing for potential vendors, and I would start out in the big picture way we're about to walk through. What can I figure out about how this site runs based on just what is in the public? And so that's the approach that I take to these tools in the first half of the talk. Without setting off alarms on the side of the folks who use the servers and without being disruptive, what can I learn? As a friend likes to say, you have to be specific to be terrific. So let's figure out what success looks like. Here are the questions we want to answer. What is the server doing? What do we think it's running? What ports are open? Who owns this server? Who's the domain registered with? And then what name servers hold the record for this domain? All the tools I'm about to describe are either available on a fresh OS install or so standard that installing them is super well documented. I say with a fair amount of certainty which ones are which. I did have to send some quick text to my boyfriend to run some commands on his Mac, which is a nice normal person computer, because there are certain things I honestly don't remember if I had to install or not. All the links to all this stuff are in the blog post of the talk. So if you want to do that, you can dive in over there. But let's get to the tools. First, we're going to talk about something basic and pretty wonderful. We're going to talk about ping. Ping can answer, is this server up? And also, what's the server's IP? And how it does this, ping uses ICMP, that's Internet Control Message Protocol. It's a protocol in the same way as like HTTP or FTP plus a bunch of others, although it's part of the internet layer, and those others are application layer. Traceroute, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, also uses ICMP, and it's a common protocol for diagnostic stuff. It is an IPv4 tool, although there's an IPv6 version out there too called, appropriately, ping 6. So ping at its heart is used for diagnostics because you get an echo reply from the host if the one you're pointing it to is out there. Implementations do vary a little bit. Payload size, time to live, time to wait for a response. And probably the best thing I found out about this when I was researching is that sometimes the echo reply is called Pong. So when do we use it? For good things. My most common use of it, honestly, has been outside of work stuff. When I realize my internet connection is being a little bit funky and I want a quick sense of how broken stuff might be. It's a really good, nice, quick diagnostic tool when you're trying to figure out where to start with troubleshooting. Is it 0% packet loss? Is it 100%? Or kind of worse, is it something in between? It's also one quick way to get an IP from a URL. It's great for quietly checking if a server is live or if it exists. And it's also possible to change the origin of a ping, although of course that rules out getting a response. But what about the more nefarious stuff? I'm going to go a little more into depth with this one than the others just because they're so good and weird. Like I love them so much, even though none of us should do this. One version is a ping flood, an avalanche of ping requests that don't wait for a response with the goal of overwhelming the target, classic denial of service stuff. But then there's another version, which instead of many, many, many normal sized pings, there's one giant ping, and it's called the ping of death. This is one of my favorite phrases I ever learned at DEF CON, and I'm really happy I get to say it to you today. Ping of death. Yeah, older systems would crash or experience buffer overflow if you sent a packet bigger than 65,535 bytes, the size of a correctly formed IPv4 packet. And this sounds very, it sounds older, and it is. It has largely been mitigated via firewalls and other methods, but a version of it was exploited as recently as 2013 against a version of Windows. It's patched now, but 2013, that is really recent history. So a few examples. Just do ping, and you can use the URL or the IP to get that going. If you like noise, -A means that it will go bing every time it returns one. Maybe you're into that. -C lets you add a parameter so it stops after, in this example, 5 pings. -I lets you set the number of seconds between pings. And for Windows, just type in CMD on the command shell, type ping, and you're in business. Next up, we have curl. Curl is a wonderful, it's straightforward, but you can use it for so many things. In our case, we will use it to answer questions like, what is this server serving? What server software is it running, and what version? And what HTTP response code does it return to various requests? So curl is short for client URL. It debuted in 1996, which makes it a nice recent newcomer as compared to ping, which came from late 1983. And I like curl either because I want to see something from a server but not in a browser, or I want to see information from the server that typically doesn't appear in the browser. So a few examples. I like plain old curl if I'm curious about what's behind the phishing URLs and texts, but for obvious reasons, don't want to open that shit in my browser. It makes it a little less bleak to have people trying to pray at me on my phone if I can do a little digging to see what they're trying to do. My favorite one, the one that I've used the most often for work purposes, is curl-I URL, it is case sensitive, which gets you headers. And that's where you get to see things like what server software is running. And if they haven't removed it from their headers, maybe what version it is. And if you're super lucky, you get a finding because it might be an older version with a confirmed vulnerability attached. That's an amazing day. And that is the same as curl-head URL, if you prefer it and find that easier to remember. And as with most command line things, you can add a little -V for some more details about certs, TLS handshakes, IP addresses, ports, just the general nuts and bolts of what's going on. It is available in Windows the same way as ping. Open the command shell and just type curl. All right, next we have Nmap. And I was excited to already get to hear about this in the talk. Nmap is short for network mapper. And you might have to install this one, but the instructions are super clear because everyone wants to do it. Or if you're on a Mac, install Nmap. The questions that Nmap can answer include what ports are open that I could possibly connect to, And from that, a lot of times you can deduce what software might be running. So what does Nmap do? There are lots and lots of different kinds of scans. You can go really deep with this tool, which means it can also be really noisy if you're trying to scan things quietly. So keep that in mind. It uses ping, but it can also use TCP, UDP, and other options to do your reconnaissance. Nmap is one of those tools where you can use 5% of it and do really cool stuff, but there are other amazing depths to be found if you put the time into it. And luckily, there are an astonishing amount of tutorials about it online. I've linked a couple in the blog post. But mostly here, we're going to talk about port scanning because we're looking at other people's servers, not investigating other networks we're already in, but it's really good for that too. So some examples. If you do nmap -p and a number of the port that you want to scan, plus the URL or IP, it will look at just one port until it's open. You can add a range with -p 0 to 1023, for instance, if you want to do reserved ports. And you can do -F if you want to do a faster, more targeted scan with fewer ports than the default. And yes, this is absolutely installable on Windows. All right, next up, we're going to talk about netcat, also known as ncat, also known as nc. And the questions it can answer is also, is this port open? But there's an interesting extra level of like getting in the weeds here, which is how do I write a get or other request? Because what it does, it's generally good for networking things. It can be a quick way to see if a port is open. But beyond that, it's a neat tool that puts you right in the middle of requests. You can start a connection with the server, it keeps a prompt open, and then you can just send your request and figure out how to craft it and see what you get in response. It can be really interesting for exploring. You can get some visibility into networks with it, and also it's just fun to mess with. What can you get? So a few examples. netcat-vz with the URL in the port sees if the port is open, just can be a little quicker than nmap sometimes. Add -z for 0 input output, so just scanning. V or VV if you want to see verbosity, and it gets really verbose sometimes, so you can really dive in. -T for telnet, which is amazing. -t for TCP mode. And then if you want to just dive in right now, try netcat-vt google.com 80. So that gives us verbose and TCP mode. And then write get/index.html, and it will spill that out to you. Yeah, try ncat for Windows. nmap.org has the download you need. So next up is a really fun one. This is traceroute, also known as, I believe it's traceRT on Windows. Questions traceroute can answer, and sometimes it just it opens more questions than it answers, and you end up in a beautiful blossoming of networking knowledge. But it can tell you what equipment sits between you and the server you're trying to connect to, who hosts the site, and also what does a request's journey across the internet look like. Traceroute is super cool. Just to tip my cards, I think it's great. It's another diagnostic program in the tradition of ping. It shows possible routes between your computer and the server you're trying to reach, plus possibly transit delays across a network. Ping only does round trip times with success or failure. Traceroute shows you everything in between. It's a really fun way to get to know some networking stuff, like the private IPs on your home devices and what it looks like when your request is making its way out of your ISP's domain into the open internet, and what it looks like when the request resolves. And the really cool thing is the route most likely is going to be a little different every time. If you run it multiple times, you get to see a little bit more of the world every time you do. And when you do it, you will probably get some lines of output that just have asterisks. This can mean timeouts, it can mean firewalls that keep data from being sent back to you, or it can mean equipment configured to reject ICMP packets, which are not always prioritized. Generally, I've used this just as is, traceroute with URL or IP. It was a favorite tool in the networking class I took at the Bradfield School of Computer Science a few years ago. You've never seen so many nerds in a small classroom leaning forward and watching terminal output so intently. The various flags, though, do let you control TCP versus ICMP for requests, the number of probe packets per hop. It defaults to 3, wait times, ports, times to live, stuff like that. And it defaults to IPv4, but you can specify either that or IPv6 with -4 or -6 flags. But yeah, traceroute with the URL of the IP gets you a lot of what you want here. Run it more than once, tinker with flags, you'll learn something cool, even if it's, oh, I don't need to do that again, because that's knowledge too. Next up, who is? So questions this answers, and note my qualifiers, which I'll explain in a minute. What are the possible name servers of this domain? Who maybe owns this block of IPs? Who's the likely registrar for this domain? So who is, what does it do? It works on both URLs and IPs. And if you poke at IPs with it, it's extra fun because you might get details about a CEDAR or CIDR range, pronounced the way you like, which is a notation for designating blocks of IP addresses, which is often how people buy or control them. If you look up CIDR.xyz, it's the best tool that I've found for understanding what this means. So for URLs, you can get name server details, other stuff, the internet, assigned numbers authority stores. And it can also begin to tell you who might own a domain or IP and where their information is stored, where the site's hosted, where the domain's registered, and some other technical details. There may be contact information in there, but most often it's business details these days, so it might not actually tell you much. But here's where the qualifiers come in. It gets its information from a whois server. Think a database of, we expect things to look like this, which is, as probably everyone watching this knows very well, not the same as things are definitely like this in practice. It's still useful though. And sometimes it's handy to see what things once were like or were expected to be, because in OSINT, additional information, even if it's no longer correct today, that suggests to the state of things before, it can still tell us stuff that we need to know. So if you want to get a little sense of what's going on, you can just put whois in your URL, or if you want to put an IP, the Quad 8 has some fun outputs. You can get a sense of the possibilities if you dive into that. All right, next up, let's talk about a complement to whois, and the thing you might actually want to reach for more, but it's useful to have both. DIG, the domain information groper. This one can answer things like what's lurking in the DNS records for this domain, what do the domain's actual active today name servers have to say about this. DIG provides DNS records for a provided domain, which can include some fun, weird stuff, especially in the text records. And I was delighted that 2 sessions ago on this track, Andrew Lemon talked about this. I suggest some things, he digs deeper into them. So if you're interested in this, which it's worth digging into, go and check out what he had to say about it. So information comes from the domain's name servers. It uses DNS information, which is the same information used to resolve the domain that you put in your browser's address bar. And DNS is the authoritative source here. If in doubt, go with DIG. And also a note, if there are many IPs that resolve for a domain, it'll show you 4. So the classic is just DIG with your URL or IP, but if you want to see more what's going on, add plus trace, and it will show you exactly how it does the search. And if you add the desired DNS record type at the end, so it can be TXT, it can be MX, it can be CNAME, any of them, it lets you poke around some more. For reconnaissance, text records are my favorite because they're used for so many weird things. I have a real love for grab bags of the old internet, and DNS text records are one of my favorite. They most commonly, the thing I've seen most often, include SPF records, which is Sender Policy Framework. Those are records that reduce spam and fraud via email. But where it gets especially interesting too, is that text records are oddly often used to verify that you control a domain for companies that need to work with you in that respect. So you can look at text records and get a sense of what marketing software a company uses, or if they have certain like Facebook integrations. Like really weird stuff lurks in there. So it's always worth checking out if you're trying to get a really thorough picture of stuff. There's also, I think it's a pretty high limit on how much stuff you can stuff in there. There's a reason that Corey Quinn calls Route 53 the only database with 100% reliable SLA, because you can put all kinds of things in there. It's just a key value store, and people do. A thing to note, depending on how you're using this stuff, host might be better for your purposes. It does something similar, but it only returns a little information in a more predictable form. So IP if you provide the domain name pointer if you give it an IP. If you're using it in a script and you just want to use a little bit of the output, maybe by processing with awk, this can be simpler for you. I wonder if anyone can hear the screaming kid across the street. Okay, I also wanted to leave you with a handful of useful non-CLI tools that complement this stuff really well. So yeah, let's round out your free OSINT tool set. I really like a tool called Wappalizer, which no matter how many times I practice this talk, that does not get less weird to say. But Wappalizer is really great. It has Chrome and Firefox extensions, among other aspects of its product that tell you the tech stack of any site that you visit in the browser. And it gets really detailed. You might open it and there'll be like 12 different entries of just different JavaScript libraries. And oh, this is Ruby on Rails. It gives you more information than you might think. So it's worth keeping around if you're going to do this kind of thing. If you're looking to be thorough, also look at company press releases, articles, and interviews, both with engineering and with executives, because surprise, people in different parts of the company tell different parts of the story. If you want to get a sense of what they're doing, what they're planning, and sometimes more importantly, how they talk about themselves, check that out. You can also look at the company on GitHub and see what repos they have made public. And if you complement that against what you know that they're doing that isn't public, that can tell you some stuff. LinkedIn, the classic, just to get an idea of staffing, especially security teams. And of course, never underestimate viewing the page source, although use this at your own risk if you live in Missouri. And also there are other great libraries. Like I stumbled on one that's in Python called OSINT, and it bundles a lot of the stuff we just talked about together in a way that's really easy to dig into. So yeah, coming to the end of part one, you can do it. These are fun and useful ways to learn about tools and computers, get a sense of how networks work, and learn things about a target. Individually, they're powerful and useful if simple, but if you combine them into scripts that give pretty output that matches how your brain works, you can do some amazing stuff. And part one. And now for something completely different. Let's talk about writing your first novel. Going back to specificness and terrificness, here's what we're going to do. We're going to talk about how to complete a first draft without feeling terrible a whole lot, because you don't need to. You're going to know exactly what a first draft means. We're going to talk about what exactly a novel is, because it's a word that gets thrown around. And you're going to know what a first draft doesn't include, which maybe is more important than possibly anything we're talking about here, just to know exactly what you're doing. So a first draft, you start in one place and you end up in another. Things happen in between. That is enough. You have achieved first draftness. Wonderful. Most likely, though, you're going to end up managing more than that as you go along. You will create people. You will get a view into a world you've been making. When the first draft is done, the arrangement of all the islands in your little imagination archipelago, it's probably not final, but the land is there once you've written the whole thing, just for your definition of the whole thing. And yeah, to be clear, when I say a novel, for our purposes, I'm referring to a work of fiction that's usually between about 70,000 and 100,000 words, although epic fantasy can go longer. It can, and likely will at some point, incorporate something from your life, if only feelings, but generally it's made of stuff you made up. And we'll talk about revisions just a little bit, because the great thing about a first draft is it's by definition not a second draft and not a final draft. But why write a novel? You have enough going on. Why would you want to? To start, for some of us, it's really fun. Maybe that's you. It could be you, even if you've never considered it. Maybe you have a character, a scene, or a place in your head that you really want to put into words, maybe in support of a goal. Maybe you have an experience you want to write about, but you want to fictionalize it, or you just really don't want to write a memoir. And the one that's probably most relevant for me in this period, harmless escapism, is great. I recommend it, especially if it's pretty harmless. Here are the only things you need to get started. You need to want to do this. Like, this is the very most important thing I can tell you. And it might sound obvious, but a lot of writing advice can get kind of abstract, especially if you're just starting. But seriously, the single most important thing, and what's funny is this is the same thing I tell people if they tell me they're thinking about moving into tech, is you have to like this, because it's going to be really annoying sometimes, and you need a love for what you're doing to carry you along past the irritating stuff. You can figure out the rest later, but if you like the idea of having written a novel better than the reality of the work that goes into it, you're going to have a much harder time doing this. And then you also need the seed of an idea. A scene is enough. A character you want to follow around is enough. You just need a single little place to start, to nourish and wait for that little sprout to come out. And that's enough to follow. And because I'm talking to kind of a tech audience, let's talk tools. It is important. How should you write this? There are a lot of different things you can type into. The best answer is the thing that you like, which maybe is the thing you use for work. That's kind of how I've ended up with the choices I've made. Here are some things you might like. Some people like longhand because it makes it very separate from the rest of the things they do. I've done this before, often on public transportation in an era where I was on that a lot more than I am The advantages of this, it's totally portable. It's not dependent on batteries, so it can work. There's Google Drive, which I prefer, but your phone's Notes app, also legit. I've known people who use Git to really good effect with this. Microsoft Word, which feels controversial to recommend anything like that, but it is made for this, and it's still pretty standard in publishing and writing circles. Like when I've taken classes, I've gotten a frankly shocking amount of docx files to review, and you need to be able to roll with that. If you want to go fancier, there's a tool called Scrivener, which has mind mapping and organizational stuff, so you can do things like move chapters around really easily. Well, let's talk about first drafts versus final drafts. A first draft, like I said, a way of getting from point A to point B, also a chance to delight yourself. It's a place to push boundaries of the story because logic and characterization haven't been completely set yet. It's probably going to have repetition in it. That's totally cool. That is a thing to deal with later, not in this part of the process. And it's an elegant first route that can still be super fun to write in all of its mess. A first draft is not a chance at perfection. That might come later, but honestly, probably never, and it's best to make your peace with that. A first draft is not your only chance to get this right. It is far from it. It's not required to contain everything that needs to be there. I have stuff I've been working on for a couple of years, and foundational things still shift around sometimes. You know, it's your world. You're the god of it. You can do whatever you need to do. And it's not required to be written linearly. Some people do start with Once Upon a Time, go straight through till the end. Lots of us don't. It's totally okay to bounce around, to leave placeholders, write yourself notes. I sometimes write my name in all caps in places so that I can Command F and find where my past self wanted my future self to pay a little more attention to. In short, a first draft is woven cloth. It's not a dress. It is a pile of clay. It is not a sculpture. This is your permission to go wild. With that, let's talk about planning. In the writing world, I have found that often people divide the different ways people plan into plotters versus pantsers. The author Kat Rambo has a great post about this, which I linked in the blog version of the talk. Plotters like to know everywhere the story is going before they start. This still usually leaves some room for change along the way, but they like to really nail it down, often in an outline, before they start writing actual prose. Perfectly valid, excellent way to proceed. Pantsers, however, write by the seat of their pants. They know some things when they start, they know more of them when they're done, and then they proceed. And then some people, and this includes me, are kind of a combination of the two. I tend to write out the parts I know, this character, the scene, the setting, get to like the third or halfway point, and then I go back and make an outline so I can start using it to navigate, because a lot of words, even with Command F, gets to be a lot to move around. Mostly though, just see where you feel comfortable, play with both ends of the spectrum, and expect your process to evolve if you choose to keep up with this, because your skills will change and you're going to learn more things about yourself. Next, this might be the single most important thing, which feels like we're starting to get into themes for today. You have to have mindfulness to be able to complete a first draft of a novel, because you need to be able to keep putting words down with the knowledge that you are not perfectly nailing it today. And for some of us, this is so hard, and it's okay. But nailing it is not today's goal. Nailing it is your future self's problem. And unlike a lot of, oh, good luck, future self kind of things, this is a responsible and self-loving thing to do. There is drafting you and there is revising you. These are two different jobs, and it's cool to separate them. Today, drafting you is in charge. Revising you is going to have different skills and priorities. Because our goal, and I quote Anne Lamott, we want to write a shitty first draft. That's the goal. Because the great news is your first draft doesn't have to be good, and odds are, by the way we evaluate a finished novel, it's not going to be. But it's a different thing. The goals are different. We're not setting records for the marathon. We're not trying to be incredibly beautiful and graceful. We're just crossing the finish line at our own pace. Because the thing is, to do this and do this effectively and do this without being sad all the time, you have to make yourself believe your story. You also have to make yourself believe that this will get better. And the thing is, it totally will. You can remind yourself that I promised you the work will get better in time, and I mean it. If you choose to keep doing this and you put the time in, it just will. And the killer is you also start to learn things about your writing as you go along, because everyone, like every famous accomplished author whose work you've ever read, has things that come up in their writing that if they're left unchecked would be undesirable in a final draft. Lucky for us, we are only writing a first draft and we don't have to fix these things today. You can ignore them entirely. You can passively note them and be the stone in the stream, letting the water flow around you. My characters love to gaze at things pensively before finally saying something. I love that for them. They can do this as much as they want in the first draft. And the same is true of themes. That's the higher level, like about of a story. A story might be about two people who go from San Francisco to Montana on a road trip. That's the plot. But the theme might be discovery of the true self, or the compromises we make in love, or something about the American dream. Themes are a concern of the revising you in the future. You have the option of totally ignoring it in the first draft. If you want, you can watch and get a sense of what some likely themes are. It's kind of fun because you start to learn about things that are important to you that you might not have realized. And then you can put them away until the time is right. Just remind yourself, perfection is not required this day, only word count and progress. Next, let's talk about motivation, because we are talking about what is, for a lot of the process, a super solo venture. So motivation, one of the best ways I know is to have a place and a time you're going to do this, which goes back to the question of routine. But the thing is, it helps to not have to do the work every time of figuring out when and where you're going to sit and do this. I also recommend bribing yourself. It doesn't have to be elaborate. But if you know that when you get to the end of the allotted time you wanted to do this, you're going to take a walk, you're going to text a friend, you're going to do something you've been looking forward to. It's a really good way to start to establish routine. We're all kind of toddlers on the inside. It's the same way that you can earn a really huge salary and free pizza never stops being an incentive. You can use that to manipulate yourself, and I really recommend doing it. There's also the matter of accountability, which I'll go to in depth in a couple of minutes. I also recommend practicing being really nice to yourself. Like when I write a note about a to-do, and I'm only writing to myself, no one else will ever see this. A lot of times I write please. Writing can be punishing. Be soft where you can. It really, really helps. And related to bribes, also celebrate victories. And victories can take lots of forms. You wrote 1,000 words, you wrote 7 days in a row, you did so many incremental goals before you get to the point of like, I did a first draft, and all of these goals are worth celebrating. This is amazing work. Look what you did. So this gets to the question of measuring actual work done, which you don't need to do. I like doing it because I need to get a feeling of velocity. You don't have to do this. You can sit and type when you want to and just be very content, and that's a marvelous use of time. If you choose to do it though, this can be very official, like I have a spreadsheet that I record things in, or it can be done informally just by taking a look at stuff now and then. Command-Shift-C in Google Docs brings up word count if you ever want to check it out. This, however, can be emotionally unhelpful for some people, so don't feel like this is how you need to do this. If you suspect this kind of really specific measurement is going to psych you out, skip it. You don't need it. Instead, if you still want to track something, I recommend keeping an eye on butt in seat, hands on keyboard time. And this doesn't have to mean like writing down your minutes. Instead, it can just mean that you always sit down for your half hour to write after work. You may write, you may not, but you created the conditions where writing can take place, and that's victory too. Related, consider finding routine and then feel happy when you stick to it. I do something called London Writers Hour. They do 4 hours most days. I do the Australia one, which happens around lunch for me. And on those days, I get to write without wondering the how or the when. It's awesome. There's no thinking involved. You can set goals for yourself, but keep them gentle at first. Ambition can come later. People don't start out right on the mountain. First, they maybe do a little indoor climbing, do the simple wall before challenging themselves more and more to the long form goal. Right, let's talk about accountability. If you want to do this, figure out if you do best with accountability to yourself or someone else. For me, I do a mix of bullet journaling and spreadsheets to keep on top of my life and progress on all sorts of things. It means a lot to me to check certain boxes every day, so this method works well for me, but you may do better with external accountability, in which case you can try posting on social media when you've done your work for the day. You can text a friend who has solemnly swore that they will send you back only the biggest, nicest burst of emojis, or reaching out to writing community. Speaking of, writing is a lonely journey, and it's nice to have parts of it be less so. I found a community in this era largely through Slacks. Clarion West, it's a speculative fiction writing group and organization outside of Seattle. They did a summer event where for 6 weeks, everyone commits to a writing goal, and their Slack was super active and really fun. But day to day, I tend to find the dedicated writing channel in the different tech Slacks that I'm in. But there's also Twitter, which I've used. And then there are subreddits that are super active. There's writing, there's keep writing, there's writers. There are a ton dedicated to all of the different genres and subgenres you could think about. When in-person things are a good idea, again, I'm going to go to local readings and talk to people. I'm going to do my first in-person writing class in several years. There's also conferences that are really useful for this. But with classes and conferences, there's still tons of them being held over Zoom. So it's totally possible to find community that way, especially if you do a class that meets more than once and you start to get to know people and get a sense if maybe their style complements yours and maybe you have something to offer each other. And this will be important later because there will be a point once you've written a first draft, done a revision of a second and a third, where you realize that you're going to need external feedback to be able to progress with what you're doing. You need an actual other person who doesn't live in your head to look at your story and tell you where things are working and maybe not working quite in the way you want them to be. For a lot of people, this is the second, third, or fourth draft when you pull in a beta reader to take a look at things. It's a really good idea, both because writers are lovely people and because you can be helpful to each other, to make friends with people who are at a similar place in their writing journey to you. It helps you learn together, and if maybe you all share some ambitions, it lets you help each other succeed. Yeah, and then after that, there's just sitting down and doing it and figuring out what feels awesome. It's useful to have an idea of where to start and where you're going, or I feel reassured by it anyway, but you don't have to. I recommend writing the thing you're most excited about first, then figure out the next thing you're excited by and keep going. There are people who do prefer to write just like straight through linearly, but I find there's some good information to be found if you realize that you were super psyched to write one part, but there's another that whenever you think about it, you're just kind of like, oh God, that. If you feel that way, there's a decent chance that your reader might too. So you don't have to obey it immediately, but it's a really good thing to listen to because you know what's up too. So all writers share some experiences, but we're all, different and weird. Still, there are some common problems that we bump into as we dig into this. For instance, instead of progressing, I keep rereading what I've written and trying to optimize it and focusing on the same 10,000 words instead of moving forward. I did this for years. It's really easy to do this, especially if you have a job and responsibilities and stuff. What I recommend to get around this is to write yourself a note about what you want to accomplish the next time you sit down, so you don't have to rediscover this the next time. Then, if you need to, just reread the last couple of paragraphs you wrote and then start typing. Minimize the reorientation you have to do, and you'll be less likely to get lost in the work. Just leave yourself a little trail, something to resubmerge yourself, and it is much easier then to not get lost in the weeds. All right, next, the common problem. You've written some stuff and maybe you kind of hate it and it feels bad to look at. This is totally okay. This happens to everyone sometimes. Every author you've ever adored, every person who's written a story that made your soul feel recognized, they write stuff that they look at and go, am I even literate? There are just days like that. There are sometimes strings of days like that. Totally okay. The more you do this, the more you're going to cringe reading your old stuff. It means you're growing. It's actually a great sign, even if it kind of makes your soul want to leave your body a little bit. It's great to have more than one project going at a time once you have ideas that make sense to be able to invest this time in. And the great thing about this is, like any kind of investment, you want to diversify so that no single project represents your entire writing success at any given moment. Alternatively, walk away for a while. It's totally normal, and I know this comes up in tech too, just to put things down and not pick them up for a little bit. I find that's when ideas like to creep in. My brain likes to answer questions when I am walking around my neighborhood doing dishes or, very conveniently, falling asleep. Thanks, Breanne. What about if you've started writing something, you're investing time in it, you see the word count growing, but you still don't know how the thing ends? This is also super normal. The good news is you have time to wander around. Try meandering with your characters more. Try diving into the middle. Try exploring your world, figuring out colors and textures and smells. How does money work? How does social status work if you need to figure that out? The end, like all the rest, is a work in progress, and it can change hugely between drafts. And that's totally valid. It's a very normal working style. I also like writing monologues from characters if I feel like I'm not getting the motivation or I don't know what's going on. Just giving them a chance to speak without going, this is good prose, can be super useful for unblocking yourself. Usually they'll reveal something to me if I just give them space to talk. And then another problem, maybe you've realized actually you just don't like this whole thing. In that case, I say congratulations. You tried something, you dove into it, you worked on something new, and you were honest enough to look at the work put in and go, this is not how I need to spend my time. You get to choose another hobby you like, and cheers for trying something new. So takeaways. Going what now feels like way, way back, the command line can do a ton of awesome, cool stuff, and you can do awesome things with the information it can give you. If you want to write a first draft novel, you absolutely can. And as with so many things, button seat, hands on keyboard, you can do it. Furthermore, Cheetah believes you can do it. She is sitting right by my foot right now. I think I just touched her belly. Susie believes you can do it. And so do I. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And there's a couple questions in the Slack, actually. One of them is, how do you define the line between creative writing and writing for a more technical audience? So the difference between technical and creative writing.
Yeah, I would say when it's creative writing, I'm trying to tell a story, often kind of with the goal of making someone feel, it can be, I love this character, but I want them to feel something and have an experience related. Whereas technical writing, I want them to come out knowing how to do something really specific. If I get bullets in there and numbered lists, that's a good tell that it's highly technical. Yeah, any kind of to do, that's how it ends up being like that. Whereas, I don't know, I want to kind of make a hand gesture like this, that just creative writing, I want it to almost just have a sense to it, which can be through word choices and sentence lengths and stuff like that. And also just what's going on there. Hope that helps. I can dig into it more in the chat if the person who asked wants to know.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. Really appreciate your talk today. If folks have more questions, definitely ask them in the Track channel. And there can be continuing chat after this talk. That was outstanding, though. That was both halves of your talk were fascinating. So
Cool. Thank you
thanks
so
for
much.
being here.
Of course. Thank you for having me.